Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the confusion and the physical problems, but I'm sorry that you can't see me properly because I'm hiding behind the machine, but I can't stand up for long periods, so I need to sit here. Thank you also to Lady Derby for that introduction, parts of which I wrote myself, so it's always the best way, I think. My own PR agent. So what I want to begin with is the nature of the 13th Earl himself, the way in which he was perceived by people in his own time, his contemporaries, and the way in which he's perceived by historians subsequently. Is a sort of group of historians, there's a sense in history that some people, biographical historians particularly, like to psychoanalyze their subjects. About 50 years ago, they would look at them from a sort of medical point of view, but now it's the mental health of the subject. So we find that historians use 21st century methods and terminology to psychoanalyze people who lived centuries ago, without any evidence at all, of course, to support that. And the 13th Earl is somebody who potentially is very important in that regard because he was a very different character from most of his contemporaries. And I'll go into more detail about that in a moment. He was somebody who was almost like the meagre filling of a sandwich. He was between his celebrity father and the politically and governmentally important son, the 14th Earl. And the 13th Earl, to people coming after his time, seemed to be a sort of relatively uninteresting interlude between these two much larger-than-life characters. It's not a fair judgment, but that's clearly the way that he was perceived by people, for example, who wrote biographies of the Stanley family in the later 19th century. They found him difficult to deal with. He didn't conform to the ideal of an aristocratic gentleman of the early 19th century. He didn't do what people of his class and position would normally be expected to do. He certainly participated in politics to a very small extent and that sort of thing. But basically, he didn't fit the mould. And people found that difficult to adjust to, I think, difficult to understand. People, including his own father, who was clearly quite bemused by him at times. So he's a very unusual character, and a character who I think has now come into his own because his importance lay in other directions. His significance was not in the realm of politics or government. It was in, as we know, natural history. So if we may have the first. So, simple facts. He was born here in 1775 and he died here in 1851. He hardly left here, except really in circumstances of necessity, going to London, for example, for political business. He loved Knowsley to the depths of his heart. Knowsley was the place where he found comfort and security. And Knowsley was the place where he built up his marvellous menagerie and aviary. So Lord Stanley, Earl of Derby, was somebody who was particularly focused on the estate and the house where he lived. And that was a sharp contrast with his own father, as we'll see in a moment. Eldest child and only son of Edward Smith Stanley, 12th Earl of Derby, 1752 to 1834. The Smith is because his mother, that is the 12th Earl's mother, was Lucy Smith of Weald Hall in Essex, who was somebody of no particular fame, but a lot of money, which was quite useful. She brought a fortune to the house of Stanley at a time when they needed it. And the quid pro quo, as it were, was to hyphenate the surname for several generations to recall that important fact. He was also the son of the 12th Earl, of course, and Lady Elizabeth Hamilton, Betty Hamilton. And we'll turn to them in a moment as well. She, as you can see, is 1753 to 1797, so she died much younger. But there was sorry tale behind all that. And ostensibly, this would have been a conventional background, a conventional sort of aristocratic circumstance of the 18th century. But the problem arose because the marriage between the 12th Earl and his wife was a disaster. It was a catastrophic failure almost from the beginning. And the circumstances meant that the 13th Earl's upbringing was most unusual, most lonely, most traumatic, I think, is probably fair to say. If we look at the next one, please. So there he is with his sister Charlotte, the 13th Earl, as he would become, painted by George Romney, almost a local artist. He came from South Cumbria. And that is a sort of conventional view of a really sort of idyllic almost setting for beautiful small children. It's the sort of thing which any aristocratic family would have wanted to have. And there's the next picture which emphasises that. So everything is beautiful, everything is exquisite. And the next picture emphasises a family setting. Not that that was a very conventional family setting. They don't normally wear clothes like that, even in the 18th century. But it's that sort of classical perspective on the young couple and their eldest child. They'd met at a party. They were married for about 3.5 years, and life seemed to be punctuated by parties and social occasions for them. They met at a party, they became engaged, betrothed very quickly, they married very quickly, they repented at leisure. It was head over heels in love, and then realisation dawned very quickly after the marriage. And as Lady Derby has already said, the circumstance was that the Countess of Derby, Elizabeth Hamilton, went off. She ran away with the John Sackville, the 3rd Duke of Dorset, who was the most notorious rake of the age. He was a philanderer of extreme proportions, as it were. Many relationships, many sort of scandals associated with him. So they ran away together, and the tragedy was that in other circumstances that might have led to a divorce and the remarriage of the 12th Earl, but it didn't, because he chose not to divorce his wife. She couldn't divorce him. A divorce had to be by Act of Parliament. He could have accomplished that, but he chose not to. And not only that, and that meant, of course, she couldn't remarry either. She couldn't be settled again. But also that his children were forbidden, or she was forbidden to see her children for several years. I mean, it's not quite clear how long, but for a number of years, she was not able to see them at all. They had no contact. And even latterly, when she was, in theory, permitted to see her children, there was strict controls placed on how often and when. And on occasion, the 12th Earl became concerned she was seeing too much of them and sort of clamped down and prevented more visits. So there was a sort of, not only a hostility at the time of the separation, but a continuing hostility. And the children, the 13th Earl and his sister, were brought up without any mother, without their mother being present. And that is a traumatic time, I think, for him. It must have been. This is the 12th Earl. The 12th Earl, he looks an imposing figure there, but you'll see from the cartoons that contemporaries didn't think that. He was imposing in other ways. He was a celebrity because of the sporting enjoyment and enthusiasm, a celebrity because of his gambling habits, a celebrity in other ways. He was a sort of socialite in London. He was somebody who had a very high profile in the media, if we can call it that, anachronistically. The gossip columnists and their equivalents were kept very busy by the 12th Earl. And I wrote his biography in the Dictionary of National Biography, and I was sort of feeling about what were his achievements, because he founded the Derby and the Oaks, the two sort of great horse races, and so on and so forth, the sporting life that he led. And his achievement was to give his name to the Derby, for example, so that he was remembered to this day, whereas junior ministers and others who are sort of surrounding him have long since been forgotten. So his celebrity has lasted, which is quite unusual in that context. Yes, please, the next one. This is Elizabeth Hamilton, the Countess of Derby. Romney's portrait of her as well, sort of rather more thoughtful than I think she normally was. She thought less than she should have done. But those are the sort of two main players in this domestic tragedy. She lived a lonely life. She was seeking legal redress against the Earl, but without success. And she eventually seems to have contracted tuberculosis and died in 1797. So that freed her, of course, well, she died, but it freed him of the fact that he still had a wife living. And then we come to the next sort of section of the story, because just after the separation, he had met Elizabeth Farren, who was an actress. An actress, the term actress meant all sorts of things in the 18th century. She was a real actress. She was brilliant. She was an outstanding actress. She was the daughter of an apothecary from Cork, so not suitable as a sort of social equal to anybody like the 12th Earl. But the talent she had and her beauty attracted huge attention. And the 12th Earl met her and fell passionately in love with her. And they have this sort of extraordinary relationship for about 18 years, because he can't marry her because he won't divorce his wife. So the marriage is not possible. But also, it seems quite clear that they had a chaste relationship for 18 years, not least because her mother went everywhere with them. Her mother was the chaperone, and contemporary observers frequently commented on the fact that Mrs. Farren was ever present. So that she would pop up with the two of them sort of at the opera or something. She would pop up as a sort of third, the watchful eye of Mrs. Farren. The gossip columnists and the cartoonists thought this was fabulous material. He was quite short, and as you can see from this cartoon, gets rather larger in the girth as time goes on. She's very tall and thin, so they were perfect cartoon material. And here we've got sort of examples of this. It lasts for about 20 years, this sort of cartoon portrayal of them. A peep at Christie's, or Tally-ho and his niminy-piminy, take the morning lounge. The reference is very obscure at times, but the message is very clear. It's a very good source of social history, in fact. So we can have this one. Don't worry about the details, the sort of what they're looking at. But if we look at the next one, perfect name, Darby and Joan. So here is the Earl, and there is Elizabeth Farren, delicate featured, wearing a sort of characteristic costume. Lady Derby told me yesterday that a large muff is a sign of a courtesan. So you can't get a larger muff than that one, I think. So prominent and shocking at the same time. And because there's no libel laws, effectively, there's no sort of means of redress, the cartoonists can do anything they like. They can make it as scandalous and as prurient as possible, as the next one will demonstrate. So there she is, stark naked. I emphasise these points because, apart from them being of intrinsic interest, this is what the 13th Earl is growing up with. These are the sort of public images of his family, his parents, while he's growing up. And I'm absolutely sure that this has a serious effect upon him. It makes him reclusive to a degree. It makes him much more reticent, much less prominent as a young man, as a teenager and a young man, than he might otherwise have been. It's part of the shaping of his psychology, I think. Again, you don't worry about the details of this, but it's all about sort of excuse me. It's all about the intimate nature of the relationship. And then they finally get married when 6 weeks after the Countess dies, they marry, and Elizabeth Farren becomes the second Countess. And The Marriage of Cupid and Psyche by Gilray. This is a sort of parody of classical sculpture, as you can see. I ought to show you the next picture because it tells why he was attracted to Elizabeth. As with many such people, she was painted in her roles, different roles that she performs. So there was this sort of long relationship, which was chaste, almost certainly so. They marry in May 1797, and within, 9 months and a day later, more or less, she gives birth to her first child. And that suggests very strongly that the relationship was chaste, that her mother did the job very well and kept them apart until it was seemly to do so. So they were married. And the thing about this is that she's the mother substitute, in a sense. She's the sort of stepmother, of course, after the marriage. But the young Edward Earl, the 13th Earl, as he becomes, is brought up to a degree by Elizabeth Farren, who was a strong-minded woman who had very high moral standards despite the scurrilous attacks on her, and who, after she married, becomes the Countess and performs that role perfectly. Contemporaries were not critical of her. They were not critical of her character, not critical of her morals, anything like that. And it was frequently said that she was highly successful in this particular role that she'd adopted. And the next one, please. Again, just a couple of pictures to illustrate the charms of Elizabeth Farren. So it's a circumstance where the family is split, and then Elizabeth steps in almost as a sort of soothing influence upon the circumstance that the young Stanley children were having to suffer. He went away to Eton, as was customary. This is a little bit after his time, about 20 years after he was at Eton. And Eton didn't seem to educate him very well. And I don't mean he wasn't educated, but Eton was not known for its educational quality in the late 18th century. Then he went to Trinity, Cambridge, which likewise wasn't known as a sort of centre of really high-class learning. He was, in many ways, self-taught, and most particularly, he was instinctively a scientist, instinctively interested in the sciences which were not taught at Eton or at Cambridge, which were not fashionable. This is the era of Latin and Greek. It's the era of the classical education, which served him no purpose at all. When he was 19, he was making notes in his notebook about the eating habits of caterpillars, whereas other 19-year-olds were sowing their wild oats in Italy on the Grand Tour or equivalent. He was studious, he was introverted, he was looking at natural history, which clearly he had an instinctive passion for natural history, and we hear more about that later on. But it was a self-created passion. It was something which wasn't taught to him by others. It was something which he learned himself. So if we have the next one. And then he comes back to Knowsley. And Knowsley becomes the centre of his life, as I said before. And Knowsley is for the 13th Earl, and it's like a sort of haven, an oasis in a troubled world. Lady Derby has mentioned a troubled world. This was the time of warfare, political upheavals, working class agitation, all sorts of disturbances. And he was trying to escape from that, in a sense, into Knowsley, where Knowsley became that sort of island of peace in a world which was full of violence and mayhem. And this become the dominant element in his life, I think. He has to go through a sort of process of political initiation, because it was expected of people of that class and that standard that in this period that they would become politicians, they would play a part in politics, because the government was unreformed. It was well before the Great Reform Act of 1832. The cabinet was almost exclusively made up of members of the House of Lords. Prime ministers were members of the House of Lords. So it's a sort of aristocratic privilege to be in politics. And it was expected of people like Edward that they would do so. So next slide, please. And so he became a reluctant politician by social necessity rather than instinct. And that contrasts very sharply with his eldest son, who becomes the Prime Minister 3 times and is a very important figure in 19th century politics. His father, the 12th Earl, was not a politician either. He served 2 very short periods as minister, but they were of no significance at all. So in that sense, he resembled his father. But he's elected to the family seat of Preston at the age of 21, straight out of university. He's elected for Preston. In 1806, Preston is an interesting constituency because it's one of the only 2 constituencies in the country which has adult male suffrage in this period. Almost all adult males in Preston had the vote, which is quite exceptional. And it meant that they had to be more serious about being elected. They had to canvass for votes, for example. In 1796, it's a very hotly contested election because the newcomer in local politics is John Horrocks, who is a self-made man, and sort of anticipating the Victorian image of self-made people who were successful in business. And John Horrocks stood for Parliament against Stanley, and it was a very sort of bitter election. Stanley won, but only just, and that really sort of was a warning sign that there might be a difference. So from 1806 onwards, the 2 sides in Preston politics sort of came together, and the extreme opposites, the Whigs and the Conservatives, sort of stitched it up between themselves that Stanley would be elected and Horrocks' brother Sam would be elected, and they become the sort of 2 MPs for Preston for the next several years. He vacates Preston in 1812 because Lancaster, one of the county seats, becomes vacant, and that's a more prestigious seat to take. And then, as you can see, in 1832, he's elevated to the Lords. Contemporaries were, let's say, not very enthusiastic about his political abilities. Here are some quotations from contemporaries. He never made any prominent display whilst in Parliament. For several years before his death, he ceased to take much interest in public affairs and occupied most of his time in increasing and enriching his menagerie and aviary in Knowsley. Another quotation. The political career of the Earl of Derby was quiet and unobtrusive, but though he took no prominent part in political matters, he generally gave his vote in favour of the Liberal side in state affairs. His lordship has never distinguished himself as an orator. In this respect, he has been surpassed by his famous son, Lord Stanley. But this is a wonderful sort of condescending put down. But such of his speeches as we had the fortune to listen to were marked by great good sense and propriety, if not by originality or depth of thought. So he's sort of superficial, he's shallow, he's just not interested. And then a very perceptive observer in 1822 noted a feature about Lord Stanley which is very interesting in the context of Knowsley and the county in which it stands. Lord Stanley had voted for Catholic emancipation, for the repeal of taxes on the reduction of the establishment of the Queen. Don't worry about that, but it's a highly contentious storm in a teacup. Lord Stanley votes, this is a Whig who is talking. Lord Stanley votes well, always, except when Lancashire magistrates, Lancashire yeomanry, or Lancashire jailers are concerned. In other words, he's a Lancashire man. He's maybe a sort of high-ranking aristocrat. He must have been in that sort of context, social context. But his loyalty lies to Lancashire, as that of his forefathers had been. And so when Lancashire interests are either threatened or sort of dissected in the House of Commons, House of Lords, Stanley is fighting Lancashire's corner. He's a Lancashire nationalist. And Knowsley, of course, is in Lancashire, and it gives it that sort of additional significance in his thinking. He's elevated to the Lords. He's so old by that time. He's 57. And what's he going to do? He doesn't want to be an MP anymore. So he goes to the Lords. 2 years later, his father dies. He becomes the 13th Earl. And as 13th Earl, he is able to do nothing at all in political terms. He attends the House of Lords from time to time, but that's all. And he, at the age of 59, he's the oldest peer in waiting, as it were, in the country. He's had a long apprenticeship, but he chooses not to become the politician that he could be after 1834. He was married, of course, and that again is an interesting marriage. He's married his first cousin, Charlotte Hornby, Charlotte Margaret Stanley, as she became, Lady Stanley. She's, I hesitate to say an easy option, but that means marrying his cousin doesn't require him to go socialising. It doesn't require him to be part of the London social scene, to look for a marriage or have a marriage arranged with another noble family, because it keeps us all within the family. And this is a sign perhaps of his reticence, his reluctance to participate in the social circle which would be otherwise expected of him. It's a marriage which is not only very close, of course, but is a very successful marriage. They seem to have been very genuinely in love and very fond of each other. And very importantly, there's no suggestion of a mistress or courtesans or anyone with a large muff sort of going around. It's a sort of luxurious circumstance. And the tragedy is that Charlotte dies early. She's only 39 when she dies. And that means that he's bereft of the only sort of personal rock which he has. If you have the next one. They have children. And one of his biographers described him as first and foremost a family man. And I think that's a very fair judgment. The family meant a huge amount to him. He was perplexed by his eldest son in some ways, but the marriage gave him that stability. And of course it's based in Knowsley, which is very important indeed. He's a widower for 44 years. He never remarries. And this is another sort of dimension to his loneliness that we sense perhaps from some of the correspondence which he left by contemporary observers suggesting that he was an isolated figure. The 13th Earl's documentary record is rather limited. There's very little evidence from his childhood or teenage years. He didn't write letters. Well, if he wrote letters from Eton, they've not survived. So we know very little about the detail of his childhood and his growing up. There isn't very much correspondence about family matters. That doesn't seem to have survived. He doesn't seem to have kept diaries. There's a whole series of lacunae in the evidence. What he did write in extreme detail was huge numbers of letters to his stewards about Knowsley. So we know a lot about which flowers he wanted grown and which yellow flags in which part of the Great Lake, all sorts of detail like that. We know nothing about his relationship with his wife. That's a sort of undocumented area of his life. But putting the letters together that do survive about the estate, it's very clear that he knew every inch of it, that Knowsley had become, as I've already suggested, a sort of the centre of his universe. But Knowsley was somewhere where he spent so much time, he knew every corner of the estate. He made a point of visiting every corner of the estate as often as possible to chart its progress. And he had enormously ambitious plans for the improvement of the estate, which had been badly neglected under his father. And amongst the projects which he undertook or initiated and then saw through to fulfilment was the building of the 10-mile-long circumferential wall around the estate. A wall which was, for him, more than just a wall. It was a sort of barrier to the outside world. In his correspondence, he implies that he can keep everything out of the estate. So his Knowsley is surrounded by this great wall, which still survives most of it, surrounded by this wall which sort of reinforces the message that it's his island, it's his oasis. And within that, he's building up a menagerie in the aviary, but also building up all sorts of other things. He's laying out new roads, including the Bickerstaff Road, which allows him to drive 5 miles to Bickerstaff without touching the public road once. It's a sort of private road that's solely for his use. He's doing a lot of work on the sort of planting of the estate. So a lot of the work is expensive. And I went through the correspondence, and I went through the account files, which are in the Lancashire archives. And I was sort of interested to know what the balance of sort of expenditure and income was for the estate. And in 1835, first year when he was Earl, in 1835, the expenditure was as follows. Annuities, £14,000. This is pensions to older members of the family, to servants, to others. Buildings, the upkeep of this building, £11,000. The domain, the park itself, £10,000. The gardens, £3,000. The plantations, £2,500. Wages, £1,700. Household and running costs of the household, £1,200. Public benefactions, charities of all sorts, £600. So that's 14,000 down to 600 for the conventional expenditure of any big estate. Menagerie and aviary, £15,000. But the sting in the tail, interest payments on the debts, £21,000. The estate was heavily encumbered by mortgages and debt throughout this time. I must, in fairness, say that most estates were. But it does explain why, for example, Arthur Haywood of Liverpool, Haywood's Bank, the banker came here dining on regular occasions. He was persona grata for the Earl, perhaps not socially, but his necessity required it. In doing all this on the estate, aside from the menagerie and the aviary, that was one of his legacies for the future. His grandson said, "I think that these grounds will not be exceeded for natural beauty by any in the country, notwithstanding disadvantages of soil and climate." The Lancashire climate was not propitious. Justice had never been done in the family to the late Lord Derby, whose plans were excellent, though he was too hasty in their execution, and thus left everything unfinished, besides having to alter his own work again and again. He got new ideas which kept flowing, and he would tell the steward to stop such and such a project because we're going to change it. So there was a lot of that went on. He found this place a wilderness. It had been neglected for upwards of 50 years, for his father lived fashionably in London and the Oaks during the first half of his life, and passed the second half in trying to repair, by economy, the damage and mischief he had done to his own fortune. So the 12th Earl is sort of the socialite and then is financially bankrupt almost. All that we do now, said his grandson, is to work upon and complete his designs. So the 13th Earl is creating a landscape for the future, and that's the landscape that we see here today. If we have the next one, please. As I said before, contemporaries had a mixed opinion of him. He was not what they expected, because interest in caterpillars and wallabies and black swans and that sort of thing was not what was expected of the high-ranking aristocrat. The political and the social side of things were much more what contemporaries would have anticipated. He was, as I've said many times, he's devoted to Knowsley. He has a benevolent paternalism about the estate and its workers. Contemporaries noted that the Earl was a kindly man. He devoted much of his time and attention to projects for the employment of labour, for the improvement of his estates and the benefit of his tenantry. He ever showed much consideration and sympathy for his servants and labourers, as the following interesting and touching circumstance will show. And that is a story that he goes on a freezing cold January day to a remote part of the estate and finds that there's nobody working there. And he goes to the foreman and says, why is there nobody working here? And he says they've been laid off because of frost, they can't do work. And he says to the foreman that they still have to eat, so find them some work to do and take them on again. They're paid by the day, so give them work. And that this sort of benevolence, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. He did all these projects to employ people. That was not the motive, but it had that benefiting effect. The closing years of Lord Derby's somewhat secluded but active and eminently useful life were passed almost entirely at Knowsley, said one commentator. Nor was his lordship's attention confined exclusively to his favourite study, that is, the natural history, but he efficiently discharged his high and important duties as Chief Magistrate of the county, he's the Lord Lieutenant of Lancashire, and devoted much of his attention to plans for the employment of labour and the improvement of his vast estates, and for the welfare and comfort of his numerous tenantry. The noble Earl invariably had at heart the promotion of the comfort and well-being of his servants, with kind consideration and sympathy. Two quotations to finish. When Queen Victoria was crowned in July 1838, as Earl of Derby, of course, he had to attend. And there's a letter about the preparations for that, in which he's grumbling about the cost, grumbling about the fact he has to dress up in fancy costume for the coronation, and grumbling about the fact he's got to go to London for the coronation. So there's a sort of sense of this trivial incident is taking me away from Knowsley. This sort of unimportant event is depriving me of my estate, of my haven. And then a letter that he wrote in March 1835. It is more like June or even July than April. This is from London. He's gone to London on political business, and he writes back to his steward. It is more like June or even July than April, but I already begin to wish myself back again. He's bereft of Knowsley, and to be away from Knowsley for him was heartbreaking. He loved Knowsley with a passion. He loved his natural history with a passion. He was a fantastically interesting figure, and we'll hear more about him for the rest of the day. Thank you.